The Vatican has just produced a new 146-page, 43,000-word study document, folks. The title is The Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality in Ecumenical Dialogues and Responses to the Encyclical Ut Unum Sint. That encyclical, Ut Unum Sint, was from Pope John Paul II 30 years ago. This study document is meant to further the dialogue about the role of the Pope among all Christians in the world, not just Catholics. It is not meant to settle the matter definitively on the primacy of the Petri ministry and the papacy for all Christians everywhere. It's not meant in a magisterial way. The study document has 4 main sections, seen here. What follows in this video touches on these 4 points critically, especially given the traditional Catholic emphasis on the Petrine ministry rooted in recontextualized understandings of Matthew chapter 16. What follows in this presentation lists many things that must be admitted to the dialogue, to the discussion between Christians on the topic of the role of Peter and the evolution of the Petrine ministry in the Church, and its expression in the claim of papal primacy. If our dialogue is to be genuine, the things we're about to get into have to be admitted. Enjoy. Questions in the comments are welcome. Familiar story, a spuriously familiar story for millions of American Catholics. But shockingly, it takes on a very different orientation when placed respectfully into its Mediterranean cultural context. Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20. Jesus went into the region of Caesarea Philippi, and he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the sky-vault man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Dipper, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you all say that I am?" Simon Peter said in reply, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to him in reply, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my sky-vault patron. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my assembly, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of Skyvault. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in Skyvault, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in Skyvault." Then he strictly ordered his disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Americans are recognized as the most individualistic people who have ever lived. Each one of us strives to be distinct, unrepeatable. In the United States, every one of us has a personal social security number and many other distinctive and singular identities. We like to personalize all our stuff. Mediterranean people, though, are exactly the opposite. This is especially true 2,000 years ago. Experts describe them as dyadic personalities. The word dyad means pair. Such people are other-oriented or group-oriented to such an extent that they have no sense of their individuality, but depend rather on the opinions of other people to help them know who they are. So Jesus' question is not a theology quiz for his disciples. Instead, it reflects a normal Mediterranean curiosity by Jesus, a dyadic personality, about what other people think about him. Like everyone else in this culture, Jesus needs such feedback because he does not know who he is. And he's trying to learn this from significant others in his life. So he asks the members of his faction, the members of his group self, to tell him. In Jesus' case, the question is particularly interesting because the normal stereotyping of that culture was not working. Jesus' enemies feel satisfied in knowing him as Jesus of Nazareth. A nothing person. To know a person's home village in this cultural world, the cultural world of the Bible, is to know everything about him. All people in Nazareth were presumed, stereotyped to be alike. Remember in the Gospel of John, Nathanael? Nathanael's rhetorical question, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" simply echoes the commonly held stereotypical image of that village's inhabitants. Worthless people, no good people, nothing people from a nothing place, lowlifes. Another stereotypical identification of Jesus is the artisan's son. The ancient wisdom observed, like father, like son. The idea was that to know a family was to know everything about every member of that family. Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all this? And they took offense at Jesus. One of the reasons for the offense was that Jesus was not engaged in the same profession as Joseph, so he was not a dutiful and respectful son, you see? And Jesus knew very well all these stereotypical identities that belonged to him. The Gospels are polished accounts. They don't go into detail or explain all of the embarrassing things that happened to Jesus and his followers. Like having to beg for food all the time, and getting thrown out of villages, and getting beaten. After the 15th or 25th or 30th time they got beaten and their clocks cleaned, you'd have to think that Jesus and his followers would start wondering if the mystical experiences they're having, the alternate states of consciousness experiences they're having, were really from the God of Israel, or maybe could they be being tricked by mischievous or malevolent spirits? Wasn't Jesus accused of that? Accused of being possessed? Having a demon? That's in the tradition too, folks. So Jesus asks his in-group for their opinion. True to Mediterranean form, Jesus' disciples tell him what other people are saying about him, and how other people are perceiving him. He's perceived to be like John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, another of the prophets. Now listen, hey, these answers are great. They're all honorable, but they're all mistaken perceptions too. Jesus then presses his in-group for their opinion. Who do you, plural, say that I am? Simon is the mouthpiece of the entire group. He responds, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now Jesus has a rather large assortment of opinions to ponder. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah or another prophet, or the Messiah. By the way, let me take this opportunity to explain that there is no big theological messianic secret to be found in this gospel or in Mark or any other gospel. As Dr. John Pilch says, the so-called messianic secret of Mark, which Matthew also uses, has been overplayed by exegetes and theologians. There is no messianic secret. When Jesus orders his followers not to tell anyone, that's just culturally normal secrecy and deception most common to the circum-Mediterranean and Middle Eastern social worlds. You can find it all over the Gospels if you know where to look. In the cultural world of the Bible, you don't owe strangers and outsiders the truth. And the historical Jesus most definitely lived by that understanding. But wait a minute. The Johannine Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Yeah, for insiders, not outsiders. So Jesus has been given by his followers 4 answers, all honorable, but only one is correct. So let the outsiders be fooled with these wrong but honorable answers. Hey, Jesus never claimed to be any of these answers. Keep them guessing, Jesus. And what happens if one of Jesus' followers gets really stupid and leaks the correct answer? We're looking at you, Judas. Well, in that case, they still have to juggle with the other incorrect but honorable answers. See? He is grateful to Simon for this information, and so Jesus bestows on Simon a nickname, Rocky or Peter. New nicknames were regularly given at significant moments in a group's life, especially to the more prominent members. Rocky has played the role of a moral entrepreneur throughout the gospel called Matthew, supporting Jesus' career from the day he answered his call and prodding it along at every opportunity. Later on, Peter's associates James and John would prod their mother to obtain a favor for them from Jesus so that they might outstrip Peter and his new nickname. In addition, Jesus promises that Peter will become like him, a shamanic broker who can provide access to the God of Israel, the patron. This is the significance of giving Peter the keys of the kingdom. See, Jesus is like Tom Hagen in The Godfather, and God is like the Godfather, the Don Vito Corleone. Tom Hagen grants others access to the Don, to the patron. And Peter is promised by Jesus to have this broker's specialty. That's why he's given the keys of the kingdom, because keys open doors, which is another way of describing a broker's specialty. Over and beyond that, Peter is given a distinctive power to declare authoritative judgments, binding and loosing, something which appears to have been given to all the disciples in Matthew chapter 18, verse 18. Okay, now, given all this information, if American believers read Jesus' questions here in Matthew chapter 16 from our intense, psychologically introspective perspective that dominates modern American convictions about self-knowledge and knowledge of others, then they will assume that Jesus knows who he is and that he is testing his friends to see if they know who he is. This is an ethnocentric to American values reading. However, if instead they use this Mediterranean scenario I've just laid out and read Matthew chapter 16 through it, then they will have to assume that Jesus does not know who he is and looks to significant others in his life in order to find out. The question is, how will you read this passage? The verse that immediately follows this Sunday's Gospel reading helps us better understand what preceded it. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Jesus went into the region of Caesarea Philippi, and he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the sky-vault man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Dipper, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you all say that I am?" Simon Peter said in reply, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to him in reply, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my sky-vault patron. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my assembly, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of Skyvault. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in Skyvault, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in Skyvault." Then he strictly ordered his disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Then Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. "God forbid, Lord! No such thing shall ever happen to you." He turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Or what can one give in exchange for his life? For the skyvault man will come with his angels, in his patron's glory, and then he will repay all according to his conduct. Amen, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the skyvault man coming in his kingdom. Mediterranean people of antiquity and today are primarily oriented toward the present. It is difficult and sometimes impossible for them to think future. The best they can do is imagine what would be called the forthcoming. The birth of a baby is a forthcoming event for an already pregnant mother. A harvest is a forthcoming event from a crop already planted and growing. In the Bible, it's forthcoming, not future foretelling. This perspective is starkly evident in Jesus' stated conviction that those who heard him speak while he was alive would still be alive when God would bestow his gifts upon that very generation through the mediation of the celestial Son of Man. Well, it never materialized. Jesus died, was raised, and ascended to the right hand of the Father. And still, the celestial Son of Man, or skyvault man, has not come in his kingdom, Israelite theocracy. It is the long delay, now 2,000 years old, that sparked a vague idea of a real future among some Mediterranean Christians. Later Germans would anachronize this as eschatology. Look at how Peter challenges Jesus. In his own lifetime, Jesus was able to read the handwriting on the wall. He had made an ever-growing number of powerful enemies. When a Middle Eastern man lives like Jesus, he is sure to die really quick. You don't need to be God or a prophet to know that Jesus would be killed soon. He went around insulting everybody in his honor-shame culture. That his enemies desired to have him put to death was no secret. But when Jesus stated the obvious to his disciples, Peter took him aside and said he had other plans for Jesus. Peter and Jesus now engage in a common Middle Eastern strategy, a social game, revolving around honor. Challenge and repost. One person makes a claim to honor, another person challenges that claim. The first person must defend or vindicate his claim, or he will be dishonored, shamed. The Matthean Jesus, or the Synoptic Jesus, claim to honor is that God wills his suffering and death at the hands of his enemies. That's what he means when he says he must die. But that God will bestow even greater honor by raising him from the dead. Peter's challenge is, God forbid it! Look, Jesus has just enunciated God's honorable will, and Peter now seeks to divert Jesus from fulfilling it. He wants God to change it. Jesus perceives that Peter is testing his loyalty to God, his very claim to honor. Jesus' repost, a fencing term describing a sharp, swift thrust after parrying an opponent's lunge, is to call Peter a Satan, a tester of loyalties. Jesus continues the insult by reminding Peter that he sees only the human way of thinking and doesn't understand God's plan. This scene between Jesus and Peter echoes an earlier test of Jesus' loyalty to God. At Jesus' baptism, God declares him to be a pleasing son. Immediately, Jesus is driven by spirits into the desert where, after a 40-day fast, the devil tests his loyalty and tempts him to disobey God. That's the challenge. In each of these three tests, Jesus manages a deft riposte, quoting scripture against the devil's scriptural attacks. Verses 27 and 28 are yet another redefinition of honor. Clearly, these verses describe reversal. What society considered honorable, like avoiding the cross and saving your life, is rejected by Jesus. What society considered shameful, carrying the cross and losing one's life, Jesus defines as honorable. The statements are vague, yet there are similar exhortations in other ancient literature. Xenophon noted that soldiers who try to preserve their lives in battle are shameful, but those who strive to die well will be better off, especially if they survive. The fourth gospel we call John notes how honorable it is to give one's life out of loyalty and friendship. All these statements, vague as they may be, are typical of cultures where speech is more evocative than explicit. Jesus' exhortations shatter the normal cultural vision of an honorable life, inviting his listeners to consider reorienting their lives by means of disorientation. A fitting message for anyone searching for new direction in life. All editions of the New American Bible, the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version, and pretty much every other English translation of the New Testament, translates the Greek word Eklesia with the English word church. Are translators right to do this? Culturally informed scholars know better. Even the Catholic members of the Context Group of Biblical Scholars consistently avoid using the word church to describe any first century gathering or body, and never use church to translate ecclesia. Why? Because for the majority of readers, church refers to a social institution of their 21st century experience, including the buildings in which Christians gather for worship. In fact, for the vast majority of Catholic Christians, the word church almost invariably means hierarchy, as it has evolved over the centuries since the resurrection. Since these realities did not exist in the first century, it is wrong to translate Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, "And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Instead, it should be something like this: "Upon this rock I will build my assembly, or my gathering, or my group, Jesus group." Because the word ecclesia has a totally different meaning in New Testament times, commentators sensitive to cultural context have been translating the word as Jesus assembly, or Jesus gathering, or, like we do in these Bible Alive presentations, Jesus group. It would be inappropriate to insert meanings from our own social experience into the context evoked by Paul's letters, the Gospel called Matthew, the book of Revelation, and anywhere in the New Testament where ecclesia is. Sorry folks, your English translations are wrong. The Greek word ekklesia refers to the gathering or assembly of people called or summoned. In the time of Paul, the word had two related meanings, depending on social context. In a Hellenistic polis, an ancient Mediterranean urban center, wrongly thought of as a modern city, the word was used to describe the gathering or assembly of politai, property owners with voting entitlements, wrongly thought of as citizens. These persons gathered because they were summoned to deal with matters of significance to the polis. The same Hellenistic Greek word was used by the translators of the Scriptures of Israel into Greek, the Septuagint. In this translation, ecclesia translates the Hebrew kahal in the Persian authorized story of the mythical Exodus. Both words have a similar meaning, ecclesia and kahal. Specifically, the gathering or assembly of people called by the God of Israel, assembled to leave Egypt at the Exodus because they were summoned or called by the God of Israel. The use of the word ecclesia seems to be well known to Paul and readily understandable by his audiences because of their common Israelite background and knowledge of the Exodus story. You gotta remember, Paul is writing a lot of information that to most Mediterraneans would be completely over their heads. He alludes to so many things in Israelite tradition, it demands who he was writing to were Israelites. In Paul's viewpoint, the Jesus groups that have gathered or assembled in response to the proclamation of the gospel of God are always considered to have been called by the God of Israel, as these passages showcase, just like earlier Israel was at the Exodus. The goal of this being called is, of course, freedom, but a limited freedom, a finite freedom. Freedom to serve the God of Israel. For you were called to freedom. Galatians chapter 5, verse 13. Can it be truthfully said that our churches are in continuity with the earliest Jesus groups? Yes, provided we maintain that the continuity we have is always a continuity within development. That essential developmental aspect does not demand that what evolved later wasn't God's will or that it was necessarily wrong, but we ought to be honest enough to recognize that not everything that evolved later on was good and God-authored. I'll give just one example. Wherever and whenever authority in the church is exercised, it must be exercised in the manner of Jesus, who came and lived as one who serves. Whenever church authority is detached from this holiness of service, it has ruptured continuity with Christ and his apostles, and is a blasphemy. Whenever church authority seeks to coerce, and therefore places itself above the grace of the Holy Spirit, it is a blasphemous mockery of Christ and the apostles. Look carefully at the graph on the screen, my friends. Within this graph, you can see from where all New Testament documents originated and when each evolved. How do we know this graph accurately portrays what happened? One way is by considering the principle of third-generation interest, an explanatory device first articulated by the historian Marcus Hansen. Almost a century ago, Hansen wrote, "Anyone who has the courage to codify the laws of history must include what can be designated the principle of third-generation interest. The principle is applicable in all fields of historical study. It explains the recurrence of movements that seemingly are dead. It is a factor that should be kept in mind, particularly in literary or cultural history. It makes it possible for the present to know something about the future. The theory is derived from the almost universal phenomenon that what the son wishes to forget, the grandson wishes to remember. The tendency might be illustrated by 100 examples." On the basis of the works of Hansen, further developed by sociologist Will Herberg, this principle of third-generation interest might be described as follows. When a first generation has experienced significant and irreversible change, rooted in some appreciable social alteration. In response to this experienced change, the second generation seeks to ignore or forget many dimensions of first generation experience, while the third generation seeks to remember and recover what the second generation sought to forget. This is the principle of third generation interest. As Hansen stated, there really are hundreds of examples of this process cross-culturally. Consider European immigrants to the United States at the turn of the 20th century. They permanently settled in, but they were foreigners. They were people who really did not belong in the American mainstream, and they were abused as such. Their language and customs and attitudes set them apart, marked them apart. They were treated as foreign to America, as foreigners, as aliens. Now consider their children, who were a second generation, trying to assimilate. This second generation was accused by their American classmates or by their peers as being foreigners, as misfits. Meanwhile, at home, their parents accuse them of acting just like those stupid Americans. Finally, we come to the children of these children. These are third-generation people. They are fully enculturated and assimilated as, quote, true, end quote, Americans. And more than that, they are very proud of their first-generation immigrant grandparents. So, they stay attached to their foods, and often to their language, and their music as well. We see this same process verified again and again. Didn't we see it among the African American third generation, who were removed from slavery and were very interested in and proud of their grandparents' generation? Or look to the Philippines. There we find the third generation Samareños, whose grandparents emigrated from Samar to Tagalog-speaking Manila. They wanted to know about the language and customs of Samar and the stories of their grandparents. And we can see this pattern in various third-generation African colonized persons. They too are extremely interested in their first-generation ancestors, the ones who broke the bonds of colonials. Or we can see this on display among American and Canadian Jews, grandchildren of survivors of the Holocaust. Their grandparents survived hell. And an attempt to genocidally wipe them off the face of the planet. These grandchildren are therefore rightly proud of their grandparents, their culture, and their identity. As are third-generation Palestinians, people who want to know the story of their grandparents prior to the Zionist criminal takeover of their lands. They want to know what their grandparents had to endure under Zionist supremacy, and are proud of their grandparents standing in the face of continued Zionist atrocities and attempted genocide. The principle of third-generation interest is what the child wishes to forget, the grandchild wishes to remember. This principle is active in the evolution of the Gospels. It explains why Paul is silent about the sayings of Jesus. It shows us why Mark and Matthew were written by third-wave messianists, or the third generation of followers since the Jesus movement. It also shows us why Luke Acts, written in the fourth wave out from Jesus, was composed by someone in the third generation of those affected by Paul and his circle. And I want you to see, by looking at this graph, the important information that it holds. When you compare the different waves, the focus of the different waves, you can see, wow, okay, that helps me understand. Look at the literature at the top of each tier, and look at the focus on the bottom. See, if you're reading any of the literature at the top, and you're confusing what's at the bottom, you're going to mess up understanding what you're reading, right? In other words, look at the literature at the top. So second wave, that's Paul's authentic letters. The focus is on the bottom. Notice how the focus is different on the fourth wave? Now look up at the top. What literature do we see at the top? We see Acts. Isn't Paul featured heavily in Acts?
Isn't that where we learn about his adventures and what a jet setter he is and how awesome? Wait a minute, hold on. There's some indications on this graph that show us that the way Luke spins Paul and makes him look might not be Paul as he historically was, because the concerns had changed. Notice in Mass, when we go to Mass, we hear the letter to the Colossians or the letter to the Ephesians. And who wrote that? By Saint Paul, right? But is that a scientific statement the lector is giving us? Or is that a respect of the Pauline tradition? Did Paul actually author that? How could he have? He was dead by the time Colossians and Ephesians were written, and Hebrews was written. And the concerns that were going on in the Jesus groups at that time were different. And the vocabulary is different. And the ecclesiology, the churches, the Jesus groups, theologies of itself and how to structure and organize because of those concerns had changed and evolved and developed. And it's reflected in the literature. Even though it claims to be from Paul, it's not Paul. Somebody writing under his pseudonym. And why am I showing you this? Because you could take all the New Testament literature on these four waves and find them at the top, but you won't understand that literature if you collapse the concerns of each of the communities into one thing, as if they're all seeing things exactly the same. I want you to see that over a continuum of time and in different places in the Mediterranean world, the New Testament communities had different concerns. They had different problems. They had different crises. And there was change. It was one, but there was change. Right from the beginning, our church evolves. It's not all the same. It's not all uniform. Authority figures in the church in the fourth wave are very different than authority figures in the church in the second wave. Do you see that? Remember, in the first wave, we looked at Jesus and his followers that were co-workers, followers. But by the time you hit the second wave, even people in the first wave, having experienced the risen one, would consider themselves disciples and apostles. Because now they see Jesus not just as a healer and a prophet, somebody proclaiming the theocracy. Now they see him as the risen Lord and Messiah that sends them forth, right? And then by the time they're dead, now they're martyred saints, right? So you begin to see them, whoa, you even have a community in the fourth wave, the Johannine community, that now has undergone several internal changes and now doesn't even see those original followers of Jesus as apostles at all, because it's no longer evangelizing. It's no longer going forth. So now they're just lifelong disciples. Are you beginning to see what I'm saying? These communities at different times in different places have different outlooks on Jesus. Fundamentalists can't see this. Remember, to be a disciple, you need a teacher, right? In the first wave, bless you, was Jesus seen primarily as a teacher? But all over the Gospels, really, especially John, Jesus is a revealer and a teacher, right? That means that didn't come from stage one, did it? Do you understand what I'm saying? When you're reading the Gospel, let's go back a step. When were the first Gospels written? First wave? Were there any Gospels first wave? Look at the first wave. Were there any Gospels first wave? Were there any writings? No. There's no writings first wave. Look when the Gospels come. They come after the second wave. That means Paul's letters are before the Gospels. Where do we start getting to see Jesus presented as someone who teaches? In the Gospels, third wave, but mainly the fourth wave. Did Jesus teach? He did give teachings. They were pithy sayings and parables. Please, don't think, though, that one who gives teachings, that means he's a teacher, right? I give you theology from time to time. That doesn't make me a theologian. Nor do I claim that. So try to understand that earliest literature as church comes from Paul. 1 Thessalonians and his 6 other authentic letters. How many teachings does Paul recall of Jesus? He doesn't care about the teachings of Jesus. So you got a whole way. What does that tell you? That tells you he doesn't see Jesus primarily as what? He sees Jesus as cosmic Lord and Messiah. That's the only reason he's talking about this hick Galilean. Well, how does he know that? Because he experienced him on the way to Damascus. Yeah. So he only rarely quotes a teaching of Jesus. If he wants teaching, he's Hellenized. If he wants teachers, he go to Plato, Socrates through Plato. He'll go to Greek philosophers, the Stoics. Why would he go? You understand what I'm trying to say? He's interested in one thing about Jesus, and that's the imminent return to establish theocracy. Soon to return to establish theocracy in Israel. That's what Messiah does to Paul. Yeah. Second wave is almost synonymous and overlapping with the first. Okay? Because Paul's operative when the first wave is. By the way, do you think first wavers and second wavers get along real great together? What do you think? First wavers think this is all about barbarian Israelites, right? We're centered around Jerusalem, and means we gotta dress and eat like people there, and mutilate genitals, and do all those things. You gotta have that nick. And Paul's a Hellenized Israelite. For hundreds of years, Israelites have been living in the Mediterranean world since after Alexander the Great. They've been not Israelites, but they haven't been doing the Torah stuff because it really doesn't work outside of the Levant. So do you think when Paul goes to as a change agent, as an apostle, out there to diffuse the innovation, I mean the gospel, to those people, do you think Paul's going to be insisting that before I talk about Jesus, come on, let's get Torah right. You got to start, I'm getting the knife out. Gentlemen, come on, let's go, line up. Is that what Paul's doing? Not really, no. He's not going to do that. But what do you think is going to happen when they go to Eucharist together? The Pauline Jesus groups and the Petrine Jesus groups. You think they're all going to be real buddy-buddy, everything's great in this Mediterranean honor shape culture? Well, but you don't think we're able to get over that. But the thing is, what I'm trying to tell you, Colleen, is there were clashes. There were problems. And the Spirit worked in that mess. And then you get Luke Acts being written way in the fourth wave. And he makes it look so pretty. Like everything's fine and they were buddies. Oh, they were close. Not really. When you read Paul's own letters, how does Paul refer to Cephas? He calls him Cephas. His Aramaic name, that barbarian. So-called super apostles. Peter and James and John. Paul was a very difficult man to get around with, okay? By the way, St. Paul, pray for us. But he was very... Focus is theocracy, proclamation of kingdom of Skyval, Israelite theocracy to Judean, barbarian Israelites in the Galilee, Perea, and Judea. All right, soon there's going to be a theocracy. That means we have to heal people, make all the excluded included, and everybody's going to get their right honor status back when God establishes theocracy first. Very soon, maybe when the Skyvault band comes, then in the death and resurrection of Jesus, it's Jesus who's going to return, and he's going to do that. That's the first wave. Group formation. So in the first wave, it's political religion. That's the best way to say it. Political religion. In the second wave, it's domestic religion. Groups are forming in houses in communities in the Mediterranean, and they're meeting together and they're breaking bread together and going into alternate states of consciousness in domestic religion in the absence of political religion, which is coming any day now. We're waiting for Skyvault theocracy to come to Israel, and we too, as Israelites, will be included there. What about the non-Israelite members, the one or two we have? Yeah, I guess. Sure, why not? They smell bad. Okay, third wave. Now, the death of the apostles has caused the grandkids, the third wave, right, grandkids, to go, hey, wait a minute. Dad, Paul never told us about the teachings. And the theocracy hasn't come yet, so we need to talk about Jesus' teachings because we're going through problems right now in our communities. Now that Paul and Peter and James are dead. That's why we'll write a narrative gospel called Mark. That's why this wave produces the Gospels. The focus is Jesus' celestial activity in the sky vault as we await the kingdom of God, Israelite theocracy coming any day now. And how do we set that up? We have to give his story on earth, which is a reflection of that. We didn't know that he was the Messiah when he originally came, but he was. And soon he will return. And some communities think he was made Messiah at his birth, at his baptism, or maybe made Messiah when he was resurrected, established as Israel's Messiah. And this is how these different communities have different takes on that. But all of them are agreed that they're awaiting the soon to come theocracy. They want to know, what is Jesus doing now? Does he care about me now? So that's that. And that's reflected in Mark and Matthew and the earliest form of John, which we no longer have. Okay, fourth wave. Now even more time has passed. Now I'm interested in, now these are the great-grandkids. I'm interested in learning about granddad, Paul. That's why Luke Acts is written, not only talk about Jesus, but talks about Paul's adventures and Peter's. And so that's why that's written at that time. And of course it's polished and spun and embellished because Luke is like James Carville for Bill Clinton. He's like that for Paul. He makes Paul look good. Like David Axelrod did to Barack Obama. That's what Luke does for Paul. And you also have the pastoral letters being written at that time because, man, the theocracy is not coming. So what do we do with these groups? Don't we need structure? Can anybody just lead? Can we just keep having these wandering change agents coming in with their ASC experiences, telling us their new revelations? No. We have to lock it down a little bit and start, and that's where we have proto-orthodoxy beginning to develop, right? And proto-Catholic. This is the sub-apostolic times. What do you think about all this, folks?
How do we actually know when the Gospels were written? With difficulty. But it is not impossible. First off, all mythicists are non-scholarly and wrong. Jesus existed. We can infer that from two bedrock facts about him. 1, he was crucified. 2, shortly after his death by crucifixion, Jesus was proclaimed risen by his followers. Elaborating on these two bedrock facts, we can discover that Jesus died sometime on or around 30 Common Era. From that, we can determine also that the Gospels must have been written after 30 Common Era. Omitting probable earlier allusions, the earliest, most convincing quotations of the Gospels are found in the writings of Justin Martyr around 150 Common Era. Justin refers to certain documents he quotes from as the Memoirs of the Apostles. He never calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but we can see that his quotations correspond beautifully with the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. in at least 2 places, Justin Martyr alludes to John, indicating that he knows that text also. Going by this, the Gospels could not have been written after 150 Common Era or before 30 Common Era. So we have a window of 120 years. That's quite a window. Can we narrow it further? Well, we can narrow it further. If it is true that the Gospels are based on oral traditions that had been in circulation about Jesus, not just in Palestine, where Aramaic was the spoken language, but also outside of Palestine, in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world, the language the Gospels were written in, then that must have taken some time. Second-wave Judean followers of Jesus surely had information about Jesus' words. For example, the tradition common to both Matthew and Luke called Q, sayings now found in the so-called Gospel of Thomas, perhaps a collection of Jesus' parables. Not only Jesus' words would have been collected, but also his wondrous deeds. For example, a collection of anecdotes about Jesus' marvels. This information was largely in the form of memorized verbal lists, either to be cherished as a keepsake from the first wave, still largely in control of Judean and Galilean Jesus groups, or ignored as irrelevant in the light of second-wave reinterpretations and recontextualizations triggered by Jesus group experience outside of Judea and Galilee. Looking closely at the second-wave Jesus groups, we encounter Paul and his clients. Paul wrote his 7 authentic letters, which make up the earliest New Testament literature, in the 50s Common Era, and he was dead by the mid-60s. Paul traveled widely throughout the Mediterranean and established a number of Jesus groups composed of Hellene or civilized Israelite émigrés in major urban centers. Shockingly, Paul almost never quotes Jesus. He simply isn't interested in Jesus' sayings or mighty deeds. Importantly for our purpose here, Paul gives no indication that he had ever heard that there were Gospels about Jesus. Could it be that Paul knew about these Gospels, but just chose to ignore them in his letters? This is very unlikely, for several reasons. A major one is discussed in the companion video to this presentation. Gospels are for grandchildren. You should really watch it after this video. So with all this understood, please forget about the Gospels being composed in the months following Jesus' death and resurrection. It was almost certainly decades after. Since the Gospels were likely unknown in the 50s, when Paul was active, our window narrows to no earlier than 60 Common Era. Except for non-scholarly conservative Catholics and other Christians, basically fundamentalists of various stripes, the document we call Mark was likely the first canonical Gospel written, and is a third-wave Jesus group composition. But when exactly was Mark written? Was it composed before or after the Judean war with Rome, culminating in the destruction of the temple urban center Jerusalem in 70 Common Era? Likely, Mark was written afterward. Why? Well, look at the comments in Mark chapter 13 about how the temple will be destroyed. Does this indicate that Mark lived after the fact? Maybe. Mark is vague about the temple's destruction. Or it could be that his descriptions of the destruction of Jerusalem were left vague because he's writing from somewhere way outside Palestine and has only heard rumors of what happened there. Matthew and the earliest version of John were third-wave documents, written after Mark. The final version of John, with its appended chapter 21, was composed after its Jesus group had become an anti-society, sometime around 100 Common Era, in the fourth wave. The document we call Luke also was a fourth-wave document. There is no convincing argument that claims John knew about the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. But Matthew and Luke knew Mark for sure, even if they never read each other's respective texts. Both these synoptic gospels were dependent on Mark for many of their stories, and so they must have been written later, after Mark. How much later? Again, the companion video to this one, The Gospels Are for Grandchildren, helps clarify matters. Additionally, we can say that it is pretty clear that the documents we call Matthew and Luke were written after 70 Common Era. Both of these documents refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. All four canonical Gospels were evidently composed sometime between 70 Common Era and 150 Common Era. Why do so many scholars claim that they were all composed between 70 and 100 Common Era, a mere 30 years? It is because of possible allusions to them found in extra-biblical works like the Didache, written around 100 Common Era. One could also cite the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, but that would assume that Ignatius wrote his letters around 110. There are convincing arguments that the figure known as Ignatius actually lived and wrote decades after this. Short and sweet, there is a great deal of complicated arguing going on even now. One more thing about John. In its final anti-language form with chapter 21 attached, it certainly appears to be the final gospel written. Could it come from the early 2nd century? Maybe. But many scholars are convinced that the highly edited version of John we have in our Bibles was written sometime in the 90s. The reason is because it belongs to an anti-society reeling in bitterness from the Judean rejection of the gospel, easily located in time, and this gospel does not address later docetic controversies about Jesus, as does Ignatius of Antioch. Thus, this later version of John comes after the Synoptics, but before Ignatius of Antioch. Thus, it was probably written near the close of the 1st century. Now, all of these are scholarly guesstimations. They're all probability judgments. They are all reasonable, but not exact or precise.
We've uncovered 503 sayings, all known stories of Jesus' activity. The next thing we had to do is agree on the criteria. How would you make a judgment about whether a saying of Jesus came from the historical Jesus or was later put in his mouth by people trying to speak in the spirit of Jesus? Some of the criteria we agreed on at the beginning proved more useful than others. I don't have time to take you through all 11 of them, but I want to show you a couple of them to give you an idea of the kind of discussion that would occur. So, criteria 1, attestation in multiple independent sources. That's just like a newspaper reporter. You got to corroborate the information you get from another source. So we need to talk about independent sources. Well, we have these: Q, Mark, M, L. That's stuff in Matthew alone, stuff in Luke alone, John and Thomas. All of them are independent. Now, some of you are aware that the Gospel of Thomas, the later version, the version we have now, is a Gnostic gospel. But there was clearly an early edition of the Gospel of Thomas that is a contemporary or maybe even earlier than the Gospel of Mark. It contained nothing but sayings of Jesus, no anecdotes, no stories, just Jesus sayings, and so it's on the list of independent sources. So here is an example. In Thomas, give the emperor what belongs to the emperor, give God what belongs to God. In Mark, pay the emperor what belongs to the emperor and God what belongs to God. There you have a Jesus saying in two independent sources that didn't know each other. That doesn't mean it went back to Jesus, but it does mean it went back prior to either of these two. So it gains a little credibility as an actual Jesus saying. The linguistic criterion one is interesting. You know, when you translate from one language to another, you kind of betray the fact that it's a translation. For example, my grandfather's native tongue was German. And when he learned English, his English was kind of Germanized English. So he would say, "out in the light." Okay? Or throw the cow over the fence, a bale of hay. Because that's the word order in German. All right? Well, my grandfather's favorite one, by the way, is "my off is all." That meant my vacation's over. My time off is all over. All right. So we have that phenomenon in the New Testament because Jesus spoke Aramaic, which is a Semitic dialect similar to, but not exactly like Hebrew. You can tell that when something is phrased in an Aramaic fashion, and we read it in the Greek New Testament, it's been translated from Aramaic. Here are examples. He answered and said. Now, if you do that on your freshman English papers, you'll flunk, because it's redundant. But it is exactly the way you say it in Aramaic. And somebody has simply brought it across from Aramaic into Greek, and that tells you more than you'd realize. Not only that we had an earlier form of it, but that the earlier form of it had probably been memorized. And hence people wanted to bring it across accurately, and so they duplicated not only the content, but also the sentence structure. Here's another one, "behold." That's the way they translated it in the King James Version. We actually have a variant of this in English. The kids, the teenagers are always saying, "Look, I went to the store, and look, that word look is hine in Aramaic, and we translated it behold." That makes it sound churchy. But it's just the word look. He was going down the road one day. Another one, "truly, truly I say to you." That was translated in the King James Version, "verily, verily I say unto you." Now if that's not churchy sounding, what is? All right? It's just an Aramaic way of saying, "Pay attention, you idiot, I'm about to tell you the real scoop." Okay? So, when you look for characteristics and idiosyncratic kinds of things like that, the environmental criterion is an important one. Some things fit the provenance of Jesus. That is, they fit Galilee in the first part of the first century. They don't fit later periods. Or maybe they fit later periods and don't fit earlier. For example, "I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." There is no indication anywhere in any other evidence that Jesus had a church in mind. And so that leads scholars to believe this doesn't fit the period of Jesus' lifetime. It's words put in his mouth by somebody later trying to reflect what they understood to be the thought of Jesus. This is an interesting one. More radical sayings are more likely authentic than ones that have been toned down. So, for example, in Matthew, "forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." In Luke, that becomes forgive us our sins. That sort of generalizes it. It's not as radical as a peasant saying, "Damn it, I am in debt, and I need help." So that's another one of the criterion. Embarrassment is one. The assumption is that people would not purposely cook up confusing things that would be hard to explain. For example, there's a parable in Luke 16 about the so-called dishonest steward. Well, in Luke, there are 4 different punchlines after that thing, and none of the 4 match the parable. Scholars conclude that somebody didn't know what the heck Jesus meant, and they were coming up with try number 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's indication, by the way, that the parable probably does come from Jesus. But the idiots couldn't figure it out. They still put it in because they felt obligated to. And so the probability is, by the way, that does come from Jesus.
What's going on? Did Jesus say, "Blessed are you poor"? Or did he say instead, "Blessed are the poor in spirit"? Which is it? Dr. Richard Rohrbaugh explains.
So today, we're going to try to show you the depth and scope of the problem. So what we're going to do first is we're going to look at the fact that the sayings of Jesus, as they're reported to us, not only in the Gospels, but in other early Christian literature, vary a great deal. And it's going to raise the question of what Jesus actually said. For example, in Luke, "Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." Blessed are the poor in spirit. Now, where did that word "in spirit" come from? Was that Matthew sticking in his own 2 bits worth? Or did Jesus say this twice and say it 2 different ways? The meaning is radically different. Moreover, note that yours has changed to theirs. Whoever wrote this, "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven," is not himself a poor person. He's speaking about some people who are at a distance. Now, we happen to have a third version of that saying. It's in the Gospel of Thomas. "Blessed are the poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven." Note the similarity with Luke. That leads scholars to think the Lucan version is original, and the Matthean version has had the addition that's probably the 2 bits worth of Matthew, who himself was not poor.
Between the time of the Jesus movement and the writings of the Gospels, the sayings of Jesus migrated quite a distance and got recontextualized. This is reflected in their variation as found in different Gospels, none of which contain dictated word-for-word accurate renderings of what the historical Jesus actually said. Suffice to say that Matthew and Luke pulled from a common grab bag of Jesus' sayings that had been written down, recorded, and passed along, and that existed before they composed their Gospels, like a document that scholars call Q, evidenced by sharing common sayings missing from their other source, Mark. So, why this difference between Matthew and Luke? Well, the author we call Matthew probably softened the Q saying that both he and Luke shared and took their beatitude from. Matthew was at a distance from the poor, but so was Luke, both being literate, elite scribes who could read and write. They were both far removed from the Galilee of Jesus, past an uncrossable socioeconomic divide. But nevertheless, both of these elite authors grappled to respect the words of the Master. And in the Lucan version of the Q saying, we have a rendering probably more honest to the pre-Paschal Galilean peasant and nothing person, Jesus. But the Gospels are inspired. Yes. What a messy business inspiration is. God works in the mess.
Here we go again. "Blessed are you that hunger now, for you shall be satisfied." In Luke, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." You noting a pattern here? All right, Matthew is at a distance from the poor. But again, the Gospel of Thomas is closer to the Gospel of Luke. "Blessed are the hungry, the belly of whom it desires will be filled." We also have this phenomenon. It goes on. I could show you 100 examples of this. "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign shall be given." That's in Mark. Everybody agrees Mark was the first gospel written, that Matthew and Luke both had a copy of Mark in front of them when they wrote. And that means that if there's a change, the change is deliberate. Well, what Luke does is this generation is an evil generation. So he sticks a little editorial comment in. "You so-and-sos, you evil SOBs." All right? "No sign shall be given." And he adds, "except the sign of Jonah." Now that could be a fairly cryptic comment. And so when Matthew tries it, he has to use an explanatory addition. Now the generation's evil and adulterous. You're getting worse by the week here, folks. No sign but the sign of Jonah, for as Jonah is 3 days in the belly of the whale, the Son of Man will be 3 days, 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So for Matthew's congregation, explanation was required that apparently was not required for the audience of Luke. So what you're beginning to see is that early users of the text are throwing in editorial additions, they're adding comments, they're explaining, and the sayings are growing. So let's look at Mark. It's a story about they bring a paralytic, 4 men, they remove the roof above him, they let him down on the pallet on which the paralytic lay. Now when it says they removed the roof, that makes perfect sense in a Palestinian context. They built the roofs by putting branches and then mud over top. All right, you could dig your way down through that. They bring him on a pallet. The pallet being talked about is a mat that was rolled up in the daytime and put in the corner of the room, spread out at night, and the poor people slept on pallets. Note what happens when we go to Matthew. They brought him lying on his bed. Another indication that Matthew is not writing to poor people, nor is he among the poor himself. He's talking about audiences that have beds. Peasants did not have beds. So when you move the story to a new context, the vocabulary begins to change. Noted in Luke, Luke also has bed, but he has something very interesting. They went up on the roof and let him down with his bed through the tiles. There are no tile roofs in Judea or the Galilee. We are now in a Greco-Roman city. And Luke's never heard about digging mud, through the mud of a roof. And the only roofs he knows anything about are tiles. So notice that the context in which the story is being told is again beginning to change the vocabulary. So that's another problem we have. When you look at all of the variations in both the sayings of Jesus and the accounts of events in his life, what we do not have an eyewitness account. Now that may surprise some of you. We now have names in our Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those names did not appear in those Gospels until the 2nd century. The fact is, we don't know who wrote any of them. We know whom the tradition came to associate them with. One of them, Luke, tells us he was not an eyewitness. He tells us he's in the 3rd generation. And he's borrowed what he knows from a lot of different folks and put it together in a story. The fact of the matter is, we do not have a single eyewitness account. Moreover, we don't have anything written by Jesus himself. Jesus was almost certainly illiterate. That's a little shocking to modern people, but there were no schools in Nazareth, none. And Israel had the lowest percentage of literacy in the entire Roman Empire. 1/2 of 1%. We have later, almost certainly legendary stories about why Jesus could not read and write. And they seem to be explaining away what was an embarrassment to the elite of the Roman Empire. But Jesus himself didn't write a book. So we have no eyewitness accounts. We do not have a chronology of his life. Mark created the first one. It's not even 1 year long, it's one dry season. And Mark probably intended it as, if you will, symbol of what Jesus did every year during the dry season. But how many years did he actually do it? We don't know. In John's account, as I said, it's 3 years long, but it's so hit and miss, and it doesn't correlate very well with Mark's, that you very quickly get the idea that the chronologies are also theological. They're not historical. These writers are trying to tell you what they believe. They're not doing news reporting. So we don't have a chronology of Jesus' life. We don't have much historical information about his birth. We have no account of his childhood. There's one childhood account in Luke. And it's both interesting and puzzling. Y'all remember the story? He's at the temple with his parents. They all head back to Galilee. He stays behind and he's talking with the elders. Now, if you go to the textbooks for Greco-Roman schools in which students were taught to read and write, you will discover something very interesting. Luke, who clearly has a very, very high-level Greco-Roman education, by far the best writer of Greek in the New Testament. One of the schoolboy textbooks tells us that if you're going to write a story in praise of somebody, you must include one childhood incident. And you ought to pick out an incident that provides an omen for what the adult will eventually become. So Luke does exactly that. Is it a historical event? Almost certainly not. Does it tell you who Luke thinks Jesus is? Absolutely. But that's the only incident we have in the whole childhood of Jesus. Now, a lot of early Christians didn't like that. They wanted more info, so they created other gospels. We have the infancy gospel of Thomas, the Apocryphon, it's called, of James. That means the secret gospel of James. These are full of stories about Jesus. And they would not appeal to a modern audience, folks. He crushes a bird in his hands and kills it. And then he laughs. Then he lets it go and it comes back to life. And then one of his playmates insults him, so he kills him. And then he brings him back to, it's bizarre stuff. But it sort of filled the need for early Christians who said, I would like to know what the heck was going on with this kid when he was young. And I'm not impressed.
The Gospels evolved. The sayings of Jesus found in those evolved Gospels should not be thought of as transcripts or audio recordings of the historical Jesus. One of the many ways we can see this is by comparing Mark chapter 8 verses 27 through 35 with Matthew chapter 16 verses 13 through 20. Biblical scholars are convinced that Mark was written around 70 Common Era, before Matthew was composed in the 80s, and that Matthew depended on Mark in order to write his gospel. In fact, Matthew slavishly cuts and pastes from the earlier Mark. But it is also clear that Matthew embellishes and augments his Markan source, adds things that Mark did not include. These additions obviously came later. For example, consider the Jesus saying in the gospel called Matthew chapter 16 verse 18. Jesus says, "And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my Eklesia, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it." Well, it's very easy for biblical scholars to tell that this Jesus saying, created sometime after 70 Common Era, but sometime before 90 Common Era, could never have been a saying of the historical Jesus. Why? Well, a simple comparison of Matthew chapter 16 and Mark chapter 8 reveals this. Matthew chapter 16 has a literary dependence on Mark chapter 8. It's obvious. Reading both passages in comparison shows Matthew has augmented things, added details that Mark never included. I invite you to get out your Bibles and see this for yourself. Read Mark chapter 8 verses 27 through 35, and then read Matthew chapter 16 verses 13 through 20. Have a pen and paper ready nearby. Jot down all the things Matthew adds to the story to embellish it. Stuff like Jesus praising Peter for his confession. That's found nowhere in Mark. Jesus giving Peter the keys to theocracy, the kingdom of God, which is found nowhere in Mark. Jesus using the word Eklesia, anachronistically translated as church. It really means assembly, or more specifically, Jesus group. That's found nowhere in Mark. Jesus granting authoritative binding and loosing is found nowhere in Mark. My friends, those details were all added later on by Matthew. Mark did not know them, and the historical Jesus, sometime in the 20s, never could have said them. So, the verse of Matthew chapter 16, verse 18 about Jesus giving Peter the keys would be later writers reflecting back. They were writing truth, but not facts. They were writing something that they discerned came from the Spirit of Jesus. So sometimes it is easy, unless you're a fundamentalist, to see when a verse cannot possibly be something the historical Jesus said.
If there is a quotation, for example, the one in the Gospel of Matthew, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church," it's very easy to tell that was not a saying of the historical Jesus, who never envisioned a church. That's later writers reflecting back. Sometimes it's easy to make distinctions like that, but I can tell you right now that in most of the 503, it ain't that easy. It's very, very difficult to know when Jesus is talking and when his followers are talking. It's made even more difficult by a theological belief.
Matthew chapter 16, verse 18 is a piece of cake, as Jesus' sayings go. My friends, the Bible was not written for, by, or about Americans, with our American obsessions for facticity and fact-precise biography. The Bible, with its Gospels, is all true, and some of it actually happened.
Early Christians did not make a distinction between the sayings of the physical, historical person, Jesus, and the sayings of the Spirit of Jesus in the church. They didn't have our historical interest. They were more theologically interested. And so if one could extrapolate from Jesus and come out with something that's in the spirit of Jesus, they considered that a Jesus saying. So the Gospels are not historical accounts. They freely rearrange history. They borrow stories. They change the wording. They adapt to their audience. And the result of that is that of the 503 sayings, there's not a whole lot of confidence among scholars today about which come from Jesus and which come from his followers.
Matthew 16, verse 18 is true. It reflects something special about the peasant, illiterate fisherman, Simon Peter, and his unique role in the Jesus group decades after his death. Folks, we keep on developing and understanding this Petrine ministry in the body of Christ. Why did the historical Jesus gather around himself an inner circle of followers? Why did he call the 12 to begin with? Was he a teacher looking for students? Or was he the founder of a religion, looking for people he could trust to be leaders of churches? What was going on, and how can we know it for sure? Just as we've seen that we can reach certainties about Jesus' existence and cultural limitations, about how he understood religion, and what exactly his ministry was about, we can also be reasonably certain that the historical Jesus formed a political faction. In the ancient and contemporary Middle East, leaders gather followers and form political factions for the purpose of gaining some advantage over others. Those who follow a leader know and understand full well what the leader is after. They join the leader because they believe that in unity there is strength, that this group together can achieve more and achieve it more effectively than any individual might do alone. Each group member is strongly bonded with a leader. In contrast, the group members belonging to the political faction have, at least initially, weak bonds with each other. We glimpse examples of this in the political religious movement of the historical Jesus. This is in contrast to the later fictive kin Jesus groups of Paul, which were examples of domestic religion, with all members bound together as if they were related kin, with fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, and so forth. All sources agree that after Jesus' career was over, a group or coalition existed that previously had been closely connected to Jesus. If such a group did exist, then it must have been formed within the framework of Jesus' historical concern. And as we've seen, Jesus' historical concern was political religion, namely Israelite theocracy. Since Jesus' historical concern was with theocracy, then this group of inner followers was related to Israelite theocracy. They were a set of persons who witnessed to Jesus' politically religious program. Within a political institution, a group formed to support someone's program is called a faction. Hence, we can be certain that Jesus formed a political faction. Factions, by definition, are coalitions. That is, groups formed by a central person for a specific purpose at a specific time. But how can we know this for certain? By applying the prevailing scholarly criteria. The criterion of embarrassment demonstrates that the proclamation of Jesus, the kingdom of Skyvault is at hand, Israelite theocracy is here, it's coming now, proved vacuous. The kingdom of God, or Israelite theocracy, never manifested. So why would gospel writers invent an embarrassment of Jesus proclaiming a theocracy and gathering together a faction around him to help him with this task if the theocracy never came? Answer, they wouldn't. Therefore, the only reason that the gospel writers would write about this is that Jesus historically must have done this for sure, and thus we can know he gathered a coalition for this purpose for sure. The criterion of incongruity shows us tension in the gospel documents. The Gospels were composed by communities decades after Jesus and his first followers, and primarily interested in Jesus groups sticking together, like fictive families, like fictive kin groups belonging to a domestic religion. But in the Synoptic Gospels, when we read about these 12 recruits, Peter and the other followers of Jesus, they act like a faction of a political religion, rather than fictive kin group founders, as the later church spun them. Recall what I said earlier about how, unlike later domestic religious fictive kin Jesus groups, the Jesus movement originally was politically religious, with each faction member strongly bonded with Jesus the leader, but having weak bonds with one another. Should we be surprised that the brothers James and John, the sons of Zebedee, asked for the two highest places when Jesus comes into his glory? No. And neither should we be shocked by the angry reaction from the other 10, because these two beat them to the punch. Neither should we be surprised when, at the Last Supper, they all dispute among themselves about status and honor, and which one of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And we should also understand why, in the fourth gospel called John, the anonymous beloved disciple, it's really Lazarus, stands out rather clearly as particularly favored by Jesus. He reclines next to Jesus at the table and obtains privileged information from him about the betrayer. Even Peter doesn't know this and has to use the beloved disciple as an intermediary to get to Jesus. All of these examples showcase something factual about the early days with Jesus. This inner circle of his followers were not really fictive kin members in a domestic religious Jesus group, and they certainly were not church founders, but rather, initially at least, were rival faction members, and they behaved as should be expected of such. The criterion of multiple attestation shows us that all the synoptic gospels, specifically elements taken from both Mark and Q, say that Jesus recruited a group of persons to assist him in proclaiming the forthcoming Israelite theocracy. And these independent sources mention this recruitment and an initial attempt at proclamation. Moreover, the pre-Gnostic version of Thomas mentions members of the 12 it calls disciples, but they behave like faction members, not church leaders. But never does Thomas mention anything about them being the 12, or 12 in number. The Gospel called John mentions the 12 as disciples, and they behave accordingly. And finally, the criterion of coherence demonstrates consistency with Jesus' historical and cultural situation. All synoptic gospels report that group members accompanied Jesus on his final trip to Jerusalem, which is in conformity with a politically religious mission and typical of Mediterranean dyadic group personality types. And when he is arrested and shamefully put to death, in fear of being disgracefully associated with the apparently accursed Jesus, they flee. This definitely conforms to behavior in Jesus' Middle Eastern honor-shame culture. So, my friends, we can know for sure that the historical Jesus called other poor, starving Galileans to be part of his political movement, the Jesus movement. He formed them to be a political faction. Around him were an inner circle of followers. Later on, after they died, they were remembered at the roots of the first Jesus groups, and gradually became legendary founder figures. Then, after centuries of pious anachronism, they were transformed into bishops, even monarchical bishops.
For examining the past, what a teaching tool a time machine would be, huh? What a great tool a time machine would be. Not only for history classes, but for theology as well. Our most cherished preconceptions and fixed opinions would bump hard against the wall of freshly lived experience. Imagine a non-scholarly conservative Christian, a biblical fundamentalist, and a creationist to boot, with the Bible as a kind of roadmap, and he puts the time machine on. Races through the ancient past in an avid quest looking for things like the flood, looking for the Garden of Eden, and all the other wonders reported on the pages of the Old Testament, like Mount Sinai on fire, right? And 40 days exactly, Moses up there. And Moses living exactly, right? 120 years. And what would he find? Answer, a hell of a lot less than he expects. And one of those fundamentalist Catholics that look for scientific proofs, who assume that today's church is basically unchanged from the church of the past. Imagine a pair of non-scholarly conservative Catholics, time travelers, a priest and his friend, a young, impressionable, neo-Orthodox internet apologist, using a time machine to go and study the church throughout its history. Let's imagine the pair traveling back to the year 999, Common Era, or AD if you like. They go to 999 and they interview the first priest they can find in the city of Rome. How might the interview go? Perhaps something like this. Father says first, I noticed that the reigning Pope today, Sylvester II, is French. In fact, he's the first Frenchman ever to be elected as the vicar of Christ. Is he not? And he smiles, Father smiles, because He knows his history, and he's in on it, right? Pretty good. To which the priest replies, I assume you mean our bishop here in Rome? At first, when you said Pope, I wasn't quite sure. You do know that many bishops other than the Bishop of Rome are referred to as popes, yes? And in the East, even ordinary priests like myself have that title. After all, it means Papa, Father. And by the way, all bishops in the church, wherever they are on earth, are vicars of Christ, not just the bishops of Rome. It seems that our intrepid, non-scholarly, conservative, time-traveling friends do not realize that the title Pope was not reserved exclusively for the Bishop of Rome until the year 1073 by Gregory VII. The title Vicar of Christ was not reserved to the Pope until the mid-12th century by Eugenius III, and it wouldn't be popularized still for much time after that. Then the young apologist speaks up. But wasn't the election of a Frenchman a big surprise? There must have been a significant number of French cardinals and French sympathizers at the conclave. Is that how he managed to receive the necessary 2/3 vote? Cardinals? Says the priest. Conclave. 2/3 vote? What are you talking about? Sylvester was elected by the clergy and lay people of Rome. Well, at least that's the official line. In actuality, he was handpicked by his friend, the German Emperor Otto III. Again, our time-traveling duo is not aware that it was not until the pontificate of Nicholas II, 1058 to 1061, that the right of election was taken away, ripped from the hands of the clergy and the lay people of Rome. At first, cardinal bishops were designated as papal electors. Then, in 1179, Pope Alexander III, note the name Alexander, like Alexander the Great, added cardinal priests and cardinal deacons as papal electors, and decreed that a 2/3 majority would be necessary for election. The conclave itself, that is the system of separating the electors from the outside world until after they had elected a new pope, did not begin until way later in the 1500s. Way later. Father speaks up. Do you expect that the new French Pope will add appreciably to the number of French bishops in the hierarchy? What? Says the priest from 999. How would he do that? Sir, you should know that the Bishop of Rome can only nominate bishops for the small neighboring diocese of Rome. We call them the suburbicarian sees. There are just 7 of them. He also influences the appointment of bishops in some other parts of the Italian peninsula, particularly those in the Papal States. Wait, I'm confused, says the young friend of the priest this time traveling. Are you saying that the Pope doesn't appoint all the bishops of the world? What? How and why would he do that? Says the priest from Rome in 999. Bishops are elected by their own clergy and lay people. That's the way it has always been done since the earliest centuries of the church, for almost 1,000 years. Besides, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, not the bishop of the whole church. Throughout most of the history of the church, folks, including most of the second Christian millennium, bishops have been selected in a great variety of ways. The practice of direct papal picking, who's going to be bishops, did not begin until the 1800s after Napoleon. Well, couldn't the Pope at least stack the Roman Curia with French bishops and priests and thereby exercise greater personal control over the universal church? Roman Curia. What's that? The Roman Curia was not established until 1588 by Pope Sixtus V. It's only been around for about 1/4 of the history of the church. Father interrupts. Let me try again. At the very least, couldn't this French Pope put a distinctly French face on Catholicism by canonizing enormous numbers of French saints? You're still confusing me, sir. You make it sound as if the Bishop of Rome were the one who names all the saints. It is true that the late Pope John XV canonized a saint just 6 years ago, but that was the very first time a pope canonized anyone. Our 21st century friends, like many Catholics today, are completely unaware that canonization was not reserved to the Pope until 1234 by Gregory IX. Before that, saints were generally proclaimed by the Catholic laity themselves. French or not, at least the Pope is infallible, right? He's infallible, right? Infallible. That's the first time I've ever heard of such a thing. Infallible, you said? Papal infallibility was not defined until 1870 at the First Vatican Council. Thank you for your time. We need to be going. Okay. I would that ideas go like that, you know? Instead of like, can you believe what he's saying? He needs to be fired. Instead, it would just be this sound. And everything would be fine. Wouldn't that be great?
It was the desire of a king to have a new wife.
Yes.
Later on, but
Tony talked about the origin of the Anglican Church from a typical Catholic polemical side, listing truths, by the way, that Henry VIII wanted to do whatever he wanted to do, and this ultimately, despite whatever surrounding situation or what on the Anglican side happened after, it all boils down to Henry VIII and his infidelity and wanting to have his serial polygamy, right? Pretty much. And we all know that depending on where we are in the political spectrum, serial polygamy can be at once unforgivable in the case of Henry VIII for many American Catholics, but for other world leaders that we happen to favor that are not Catholic, serial polygamy can be perfectly acceptable.
You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just like, I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy.
So it's a problem, serial polygamy. Sure. It's a problem. It's a problem. But having said that, just to go back to what you're saying, having said that, I don't want to trump the argument any further. Let me just say this. It's true. Henry VIII is an abominable figure, crazy figure, and he's involved in it. So too, also from the very beginning, we have had Judases, Peters, people that are not the best moral exemplars of the faith, and popes at the time of King Henry VIII were, by the way, gladly granting divorces all over the place. And please understand that Bishop Fisher and Thomas More didn't die because of the sanctity of marriage. That wasn't what they were dying for. They were dying for representing conscience. That's what they were dying for. They were martyrs. Okay. They're also counted as martyrs in the Anglican tradition, whereas Henry VIII is not. So let's not misrepresent the Anglican Church as if it stopped its evolution with Henry VIII. A little bit after Henry VIII, we had Mary, Bloody Mary, that began torturing the hell out of people. England as a whole was so ravaged by Catholics and Protestants, both. All those experiments happened in a very bloody way, and still in North Ireland, in a very bloody way, going on and on and on and on and on and on and on. When you look at all of that, you see that there are some legitimate things that came out of the Anglican Communion. And it's a product of a tug of war that happened there, of a lot of evil forces, and there were good forces too. Common folk, people like Shakespeare who write Macbeth in a way as a reaction to the way, the gunpowder plot, which just ruined Catholics after that. Trying to blow up Parliament, Catholic fanaticism. There's a whole lot to that story. Shakespeare was Catholic. And then he's writing, in a way about himself when he does The Tempest, as the old wizard of the old ways of England that will never be the same way again, because they change. Things change in time. Shakespeare saw relatives of his hung, drawn, and quartered. That was in Catholic England as well as in Protestant England. So these were horrible, horrible, horrible police state times. Okay, horrible times. Am I going to judge the entire Anglican Communion based on that? There's a popular shirt I used to wear. When does your church begin? And of course, down at 33 AD, the Catholic Church begins. And Luther, if you're Lutheran, your church began this year. If you're this guy, if you're a schismatic Eastern Orthodox, your church began. I used to wear that back in 2000. I went to Disney World with it on. I'd walk around proudly with my black shirt on, with all this "why I'm proud to be Roman Catholic" shirt. That's how I used to be. I was very much spoon-feeding from that kind of mentality, which I would even say is much more severe than what you get on EWTN. That's the actual right fringe of that. I don't think that's authentic. I don't think that's a way to look for who's the authentic one. I think that's a competitive thing that's just, it's problematic. Yeah.
Folks, I want to talk to you about something today that's extremely uncomfortable, but I know there's a lot of people watching these videos that are not just Catholic, and that's beautiful. I know there are people watching these videos who are not Christian, and that's fine too. It's beautiful. Speaking to my Catholic Christian brothers and sisters, we got to be honest with the devastating report released by the Vatican today and face the truth about John Paul II, who is called Saint and Great. Pope John Paul II was a disaster for the Catholic Church. Iron-willed, demanding absolute authority and dominion, convinced he was always correct, impatient with anyone who would dare to differ with him. That's John Paul II, folks. Let me ask you, are these the qualities of someone who should be canonized? Now add to this his greatest failure and betrayal of Christ, the sex abuse crisis of the clergy. And here today in the news, revelations from an earth-shattering Vatican report that JP2 knew of ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick's misconduct allegations. He knew and was aware and dismissed accusations of the sex predator Theodore McCarrick. He did nothing for the victims. Instead, he enabled evil. And this becomes very ironic because, when it suited him, he was swift and devastating in his actions. If he ever perceived a threat to the church, if one of his theological bugaboos was jabbing him in the side, he hurled thunderbolts from Mount Olympus. JP2 was brutal with 20th century theologians. Seeking to reverse the course of Vatican II and restore the preconciliar status quo, John Paul II unjustly disciplined so-called threats. He sought to silence and repudiate theologians like Hans Küng, Edward Skillebeck, Leonardo Boff, and Charles Curran. But sex abuse committed by clergy on lay people? Keep a low profile. Here's your archdiocese to administer. Here's a little reward. Let's make you a cardinal. Like his watchdog, Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, John Paul II called his favorite doctrinal corners irreversible and definitive. Well, my friends, we need to reverse a whole lot these days in the Catholic Church, starting with the damages done by the terrible papacy of John Paul II. If you were a Catholic growing up in the 1980s and 90s, you very well might think of JP2 as the definitive pope. And should you do so, like many of that generation's Catholics do, it won't be the result of critical reflection or serious theological investigation and looking at hard facts honestly. It's much more simple. His devastatingly long papacy imprinted your earliest years to where it became, for you, unthinkable to have another kind of pope. Plus, if you're shocked and outraged by what I am saying to you, you were probably cooked in an echo chamber. Of course, being thrown into that bubble wasn't your fault, but remaining there, however, is. Canonizations of popes these days are a degenerate affair of church politics. We have to stop this idiocy that if a pope, then a saint. It's dangerous nonsense. History records popes, some even teenagers, ruling secular kingdoms filled with torture and murder, with papal bastards managing affairs. Now, you might come at me with an objection, but he did so much good. Yes, John Paul II did do some good things. He did wonderful ecumenical interreligious things, but he also betrayed the Second Vatican Council, and his record speaks for itself. Look at the ultra-conservative bishops he appointed. Look at the state of American bishops in the United States right now, ready to go into schism with Pope Francis. A lot of that comes from John Paul II, folks. And his so-called wins also demand criticism. For example, on the surface, it may appear that John Paul II apologized for sins the Catholic Church committed against the Jewish people. We're talking centuries of pogroms, violence, vituperation, and damning accusation. But if you look deeper, you'll see that we have yet another John Paul II failure. His theologically narrow understanding of church, really the hierarchy, never said or did anything wrong according to him. It was the dumb, sinful laity that did that evil that went along with the Nazis. That's a lie, folks. And what about the greatest failure of John Paul II? Without doubt, his worst sin and failure was the sex abuse scandal on the priesthood. And we know now that John Paul II knew about the allegations of people like Cardinal McCarrick 2 decades before he was defrocked. The report released today by the Vatican shows the devastating effects of clericalism. The way things continue to operate, clergy are the only ones that matter in the Catholic Church. Go work for many a diocese and criticize the structures and see what happens to you. See the passive-aggressive attitudes come out. See the resistance and the stonewalling. See the manipulation eventually be blacklisted. I am a living testimony to the cruelty of an archbishop and systemic evil in a diocesan structure, my friends. Many worship John Paul II in the United States. We engineer echo chambers, shrinking in members and concentrating in stupidity. In so many Catholic circles throughout the U.S., you must never criticize a priest, much less the great John Paul II. Don't you dare suggest that JP2 sided with abusers over victims, disregarded and dismissed complaints, and while savaging honest theologians kept discipline light with abusive monsters like McCarrick. Well, I'm sorry, ultra-conservative bishops. The cat is out of the bag. Your beloved Pope was informed in 1999 that Bishop McCarrick took advantage of young seminarians under his authority. And what did Saint John Paul the Great do? He rewarded McCarrick, made him the Archbishop of Washington, and then a cardinal. This is institutional evil, and you are okay with this? The secret official Catholic playbook has to say, to hell with the victims. I have to believe that because it's plainly evident in John Paul II's dealings with Maciel, Degollado, and McCarrick. Whatever McCarrick said took precedence over little common nothing people who should keep their trap shut, take it, and offer it up. That's the JP2 way. Clericalism is real and it's deadly. Its effects are not limited to covering up clergy sex crimes. I worked for 21 years in an archdiocese where many priests embezzled parish funds and donations. Meanwhile, the laity, like a battered codependent spouse, kept enabling and making excuses. It's a classic addictive relationship where the codependent is drugged into a stupor by endless sentimentality and devotions. I know priests who stole enough from South Florida parishes to purchase expensive homes just a county away. And then they stashed into these homes their secret lovers and sometimes legally married husbands, and these homes were lavish. This on top of receiving endless stipends, meal tickets, vacation trips, 401ks, the best medical care, and on. Oh yes, also don't forget to add wage theft committed against parish employees and school teachers, maintenance people, while holding a sword of Damocles over their heads. And I know that there are heroic, wonderful priests. There are also wonderful, heroic lay people. I know heroic priests and lay people driven into poverty for daring to oust or make public crimes. So what to do about JP2? Theological evolution needs to ontologically leap, folks. We need to fast-track a mechanism to decanonize John Paul II and repent of our grotesque clericalism. For starters, we should immediately strip all Catholic schools, buildings, and institutions of the name John Paul II. And it's not enough to claim that McCarrick simply deceived the poor, yet somehow great John Paul II, like George Weigel argues. JP2 must come down. Ever hear a Christian tell you that their church uses the entire Bible? That theirs is a Bible-believing church? Don't believe them. When we say that we use the entire Bible, we Christians are engaging in the worst kind of lie, not only deceiving other people, but ourselves as well. Consider this with the question, how should we do church? That's a question all Christian traditions ask and attempt to answer. And so all of us look to the New Testament as a source for ecclesiology today. Ecclesiology meaning a theological examination of what the Eklesia, or assembly of believers, is and should be. So the New Testament serves all Christian traditions and groups both in a descriptive and a prescriptive function. Descriptively, the New Testament provides the best evidence of what the universal Jesus group and the local Jesus groups were actually like in the earliest period of their individual and collective histories. Prescriptively, the New Testament provides normative criteria by which to answer the question, how should the universal body of Christ and individual communities within the body function today? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We Christians must resist the temptation to jump too quickly to the more engaging level of prescription before the hard work of description has been completed. Both the descriptive and the prescriptive tasks are affected to one degree or another by the matter of the canon within the canon. What's that? The word canon is derived from the Greek kanon, for rule or list. The canon of sacred scripture is the official list of books that the Church, post-Constantine, regards as inspired. All Christian groups agree at least upon 66 of these books. And we all agree on the same 27 New Testament documents. And we all, in one way or another, consider the books of this canon all official, authoritative, and inspired. At least that's what we tell ourselves. However, several biblical scholars, including James D.G. Dunn and Richard Rohrbaugh, refer to another canon, a canon within the canon. That is, an unofficial list of texts and themes that have become normative for some scholars and church traditions in their interpretation of the whole of Scripture, and particularly the whole of the New Testament. Whatever the theory of canonicity, Dunn writes, the reality is that all Christians have operated with a canon within the canon. Anyone who uses his New Testament a great deal will at once acknowledge that some pages are more grubby with finger marks than others. All Christians, no doubt, operate on the principle of interpreting the unclear passages by means of the clear. But of course, a passage which gives a clear meaning to one is precisely the unclear passage for another, and vice versa. Folks, the canon within the canon tends to be, for all practical purposes, the real canon. It is the real Bible we read. It is the part of the Bible that we, in our particular Christian groups or traditions, actually use. And the rest, we ignore. While giving lip service to reading the whole Bible, which is a self-deceptive lie and utter nonsense, all Christian groups, Catholics and Orthodox included, shrink the canon down to the parts of the Bible that each of our groups thinks is theologically and culturally congenial to us. This little teeny bit of the Bible is what we deem usable by us and compatible with who we are in our specific Christian groups. Is it really an oversimplification to say that until very recently, The effective New Testament canon for Catholic theology, especially for Western or Roman Catholicism, has been Matthew chapter 16, verses 17 to 19, and the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, together with John chapter 21, shunted to reinforce Matthew chapter 16, verses 17 to 19. It's not an oversimplification, that's a fact. That is the real Bible for most Catholics. The canon for most Protestant theology has clearly been some letters of Paul. For many Lutherans, indeed, justification by faith is the theme that is the real canon within the canon, so emphasized that it interprets or distorts everything else in the library. Eastern Orthodoxy and the mystical tradition within Western Christianity draw heavily or principally from the Johannine writings, while Pentecostalism looks for its authentication to the book of Acts. Or again, the canon for 19th century liberal Protestants was so-called historical Jesus. I should say so-called historical Jesuses, plural, because for every scholar in the 19th century, there was a different biography of Jesus, really an idealized autobiography of the author himself. Whereas after the First World War, the focus of authority for many Christian theologians became the kerygma, the proclaimed message. This is how it was for people like Rudolf Bultmann, influenced by Martin Heidegger. While more recently, others have sought to orient themselves in relation to the apostolic witness. Now you might object and say, well, my Christian group, let's say I'm a Catholic, I follow the common lectionary. We read the entire Bible in a 3-year period. Stop it. That's nonsense. Look at these books on the screen. The common lectionary barely covers any of these books. And when it does, it twists these verses out of the context from the original books, giving you a Frankenstein splice of different texts in what amounts to another canon within the canon. Perhaps most arresting of all, we have to remind ourselves, and by we I mean all Christian groups today, since in the New Testament, proto-Orthodox or proto-Catholic ideas are only one strand within the entire New Testament library, consequently, Orthodoxy itself is based on a canon within the canon. The truths that were arrived at by the Council of Nicaea and Chalcedon are also based on a canon within the canon. Like it or not, then, all Christians have operated and continue to operate with a canon within the New Testament canon. Since the New Testament library, in fact, enshrines such a diversity of first-century messianist beliefs, it cannot be otherwise. So it's inevitable today that you're going to have Christians, Catholics and Eastern Orthodox included, that will look at Paul and his writings and find him most congenial. And right next to him is another Christian, maybe even from the same tradition, who will recoil from Paul and find his writings repugnant, but be perfectly relaxed with John. And yet another Christian comes along and is puzzled by both of his fellow Christians because he can't stand Paul or John, but prefers the simplicities of Acts and the orderliness of the pastorals. You know, when we recognize the reality that each of us does in fact operate with a canon within the canon, it gives us much to think about. Like, should we ever really use the term Bible Christian or Bible-based church?
I was talking to a seminarian who became a priest recently, young man, and we were talking about how there's going to be like an ecumenical meeting that's taking place very soon between the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church. And it could actually develop into something really great, even greater than Vatican II, perhaps. All right? Now, do you think that if that were to happen and there were to be reunification with the Eastern Orthodox, that would be, do you imagine that being the Eastern Orthodox bishops all getting down on their knees saying, we were wrong. You are more than just first among equals, Holy Father, Francis. You alone have kept the integrity. We have fallen into heresy for over 1,000 years, since 1054, well, almost 1,000 years, since 1054. And now we decide to come back. We will do Mass your way. You want to know what the seminarian said to me? Our theology is more advanced, more evolved than theirs. So they're children compared to us. That's how he would go into that dialogue. If he was to dialogue with an Eastern Orthodox priest, I go, let me ask you something. I go, we have Catholics, Eastern Catholics, who don't accept original sin. They don't deny it, but they just never evolved that. I don't have the time to go into that, but original sin is something that's peculiar to Western Christians, Catholics and Protestants, because Pelagius, who came up with Pelagianism, or it's attributed to him anyway, a heresy, a rigorist heresy, he was a Welsh monk, so that's the Western Christianity. They never had a Pelagius in the East, so they never needed an Augustine to come up with a biological idea of original sin. So they don't have original sin in the Eastern Church, whether it's Catholic, that is in communion with the Pope, Maronite, Melkite, they don't think, they still have infant baptism, but they don't have the idea of original sin. Neither do the Eastern Orthodox. So I asked him, I said, I'm not going to tell you his name. I go, Deacon, what would you say to that person, to a priest belonging to one of those traditions that's already a Catholic? Still say they're primitive. The Latin theology is better, more guided by the Holy Spirit, crystal stream. No, I got to tell you, if the East and the West really come together, those two lungs of the church, right? I got to tell you, it's got to be humble pie on both sides. Do you think those guys who have married clergy are just going to get down on their knees and say, oh, your way is better? Which a lot of was produced by historical accident. Where's the humility in that? On our side, where's the servant that we sing all the time at Mass? Will you let me be your servant? You really want to really believe that song? Well, if you really believe that song, then you're going to have to get down on your knees and you're going to have to serve and wipe the shit on the feet like Jesus did in John. Instead of, blah, 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 verbal orthodoxy, talk. Because if you really want ecumenical people getting together and the body of Christ being healed, stop revving up the chainsaw. You're always revving up the chainsaw with that kind of attitude. You and me both. That's the problem. So what is Vatican II challenging us, calling us to? I'm trying to show you how this is very shocking stuff.
For a long time before the Second Vatican Council, the people of God, the Church, the Kingdom of God, the Catholic Church, and the Roman Catholic Church were all assumed as being one and the same by Catholic theology. Therefore, it followed that since they were all identical, all human beings must be, in the least by desire, related to the Catholic Church, and all activities of the Catholic Church must be related to its own expansion and numerical growth in membership. It seemed like the goal of all history was everybody becoming Catholic. While it is true that the Second Vatican Council proposes that all men are called to be in the new people of God, it does not define people of God and the Catholic Church, or even the Church, as identical, one and the same. Yves Congar admitted this in his dispute over the matter with Karl Rahner. People of God is larger than the Church, and the Church is subordinate to people of God, just like the Church is less extensive than the kingdom, and the Church is subordinate to the kingdom.
If that's true, how do we relate to our non-Catholic Christian brothers and sisters? And how do we relate to our Jewish and Muslim and Hindu brothers and sisters, and our atheist brothers and sisters? Not only in the church do we find the people of God. Not only in the Catholic Church do we find Christians. So in the Catholic Church, we do not have all there is that is church. And in the church, we do not have all there is that is the people of God. And this is the first word. This isn't the last word. Yes, Lennis?
How does that play then? How does that play with evangelization?
That's perfect. It radically changes it. On one hand, it begs us to go back and see what the gospel was for Jesus and Paul. And that's wonderful to do at Bible Alive. And there we will see that that was an Israelite business. Yes or no? For Jesus, the gospel was to proclaim imminent Israelite theocracy, where justice, no more, no less, honor statuses would be restored in the Israelite theocracy. For Paul, God, the God of Israel, has done this by raising Jesus from the dead, soon to return as cosmic Lord and Messiah to inaugurate theocracy to Israel. As time passes, God opens the door to non-Israelites. God is the founder of that which would eventually become Christianity. Not Paul, not Jesus. Whenever you hear Jesus is the founder of Christianity, it's wrong. Whenever you hear Paul was the founder of Christianity, wrong. God was the founder of Christianity by opening up non-Israelites in a comedy, allowing them to take part, and it keeps growing. It keeps growing. So kingdom of God, evangelization, therefore, for Christians, right, is to proclaim the life that is already everywhere and always. The life and the peace and the goodness that is in all things, in all human endeavors. And to say that that has a name, Jesus. It is not proselytism, the attempt to dislodge people from their current religious associations. Anything that is proselytism is not evangelization, and that distinction must be maintained. Is that helpful?
Absolutely.
Go for it, Mary.
Well, the thought is how it affects evangelization is that instead of placing ourselves as opponents to others, we instead place ourselves in service to them. And that would be...
Which goes right back to the servant church. That's exactly right. By the way, that wasn't only motivated by Catholics, that was motivated by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran martyr. The church, if it's to exist today, must exist as a religionless Christianity. She cannot be identified, the church, with the trappings of church. She has to be a servant church serving all humankind. Cardinal Suenens, Pope John the 23rd picked that up in Vatican II. That's influence from Luther. Yes, Vanessa.
But aside from our other denominations, but for me, this kind of made me think of like the church of how even in the Catholic Church, our church has to be servant to its people. Because I've been
ad intra, yeah.
I've been in churches where the priest works 9 to 5, and I'm like, do you know, so do I, so when can I meet with you? Or, you know,
yeah.
you're thinking, well,
no, that's very big. That's very big for young adults, by the way. For millennials and Gen Xers, I'm not a young adult, but Gen Xers too, working very hard, coming to, absolutely no understanding, no feeling, no compassion. You got to come to me. Is that the spirit of a servant? Then you have other priests, like at University of Gainesville, that have mass at 11 o'clock at night, right after coffee shop. They do this, and everybody's like, that's crazy. Yeah, it's crazy for you, but it's not crazy for the collegians.
Yeah, for me, when I was in college, we had mass at 10 p.m. or when we were all done studying.
Where are the young adults? Where are the young adults? Where are the young adults? Oh, they're lazy. They're so lazy, paying off $200,000, $300,000 of debt, and absolutely having no job opportunities awaiting them. On the other hand, are there some things that are true that millennials need to change? Yes, so do we, by the way, and so do the baby boomers. Everybody needs to change. Everybody needs to change. But let us first be a servant, ready to listen actively first to the needs of the people. If you have a gap, where are the young adults, right? You need to ask, what am I not doing to serve them? And then to bring them to manipulate, by the way, not the way you meant, of course, you meant this in service, Lenore, but the way most of us, what's the way I can manipulate them into the web and tie them up? What way? I'll be open to the young adults, and as soon as the young adults come, we need you all to lift all those things. We need you to go do this, clean that gutter thing out. We need you to go help us on the roof because we can't afford roof repairs. Believe me, that's how it is. That's how they're addressed continuously. And then, oh, isn't it great? Those young adults are working hard now. Good. Instead of being lazy and entitled. That's good for them. This is something again and again and again, and if you don't have eyes to see it, you won't see it. It's just as simple as that. Do you think that's going to open the doors or close the doors on people? Are you serving them when you go, why is that baby crying? All I want to do is pay attention to the Mass, and that couple has to bring their baby. They can't control their kids. All the while, pro-life, 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 pro-life. But
$1 million to get a crying room.
That's it. Get the crying room, shove those kids in there, put the sound down, possibly leak in some chloroform into the room so everybody's just unconscious, not the lethal levels. That's even better. And then we'll all sing together. Will you let me be your servant? Let me be as Christ to you. Christ would turn the chloroform on. Shut those brats up, truly true. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, in the early church, early Jesus group, she got moms with the babies there, and they're crying Latin. Nobody's listening to that because everybody's blabbing into collectivism. It was never about an intellectual thing. But now it's become that because we're Americans, so Americans have to have, I gotta hear that homily. Oh my God, it's a comedy. This is bad comedy. Okay, here we go. See, this is the problem. We've evolved our understanding of Eucharist into let's put a magical force field. Only the worthy can come through to receive Jesus. Wasn't Jesus the guy who ate with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners? We have turned the gospel 180 degrees around on that one, my friends. We have made it the table for the good son who lives at the house. We have completely misinterpreted and misunderstood the prodigal son. Luke chapter 15. I say that all the while still being a Catholic. I love the Catholic Church. But I got to call us out when we're hypocritical. So we need to look at these things. Jesus went and healed and included the excluded, those who were absolutely reprobate, absolutely loss of all meaning and identity, and he included them. Completely excluded from the life of Israel. Are we doing that? This is a problem. And the fact that we cannot criticize ourselves shows you how much we reject the prophetic spirit. Because the prophetic tradition of Israel and the church is one that always says we got problems that we need to face. There have been good things that have come from Constantinian synthesis and Constantinian Christianity. Universities, universal recognition of human rights, which has given us a lot of things. Many, many wonderful things. I'm not going to cut that out. I'm with the Acton Institute on that, okay? I'm all for that. But Constantinian Christendom, Constantinian Christianity has to give way to prophetic Christianity, which speaks truth to power.